Good afternoon. This is Jim Whitehead of All Power Group. And today I'm in the Power Coffee News arena. You know, I have two channels. One is an animal channel, and the other one is a coffee channel. Two of my most favorite things in life. Anyway, starting right along here, and again, you'll see at the bottom here some of the units I've used. I started roasting expectations in about 2018, and I had studied coffee for so long. And yes, I was a generator company, but I said, you know, I want to start a roasting business, and I looked at it as an opportunity to have an additional job when my generator business, because of my age and the heat in Florida, I had it where, because I'm outside every day, all day, and when you're fixing a generator, you're out in the heat, and Florida is just hot. And it was okay when I was younger, but as I'm 70, almost 76 now, but when I was 67, I started having some problems dealing with the heat. So I said, you know, I'm going to actually do and start a coffee business, fully expecting that I would be able to switch over to the coffee business after I had to stop the generator business. But what ended up happening is we decided to move. So it wasn't really good planning, I guess you might say. But anyway, the landscape of modern coffee roasting is diverse, with a wide array of manufacturers offering drum roasters that cater to everyone from home enthusiasts to large-scale industrial operations. Today's drum roasters, and again, we're also going to be talking about what we call fluid bed roasters. And I'll give you my opinion and what I ended up having. But they seamlessly blend traditional designs, because coffee roasters go back 100 plus years. You would certainly expect in 100 years that a lot of things have gotten better. And the two types, besides a drum roaster, there's a fluid bed roaster, and I will be explaining that. But the neat thing that's happened is they've more or less converged a little bit in some cases. So it isn't where you just like, you either go this way or you go that way. It kind of can be a blend of things that make sense. They have improved advanced automation, precise temperature control, and you'll see what I'm talking about later, air control. They also have very innovative heating methods. So let's start off by talking about the category that I would call home roasters. Now, somebody would say, oh, you can only use these at home. No, you can use them any way you want, but they don't produce or roast a lot of coffee in one sitting. Now, you know, if you wanted to start a small coffee business, which I did, any of these that I'm talking about now that you can, they call them home roasters, could be used in that, you know, where you're roasting coffee to sell. And the only downside of the smaller roasters is they only roast, in essence, a relatively small quantity of green coffee beans. So if you're selling it and the business starts to grow, you're going to say, I can't roast fast enough, which is good news in one sense, and it allows you to build up some revenue so that you may say, I might keep this as what we call a sample roaster, and I'm going to go to a larger roaster that allows me to roast more pounds of coffee in one roast. Anyway, these machines are designed for personal use, typically roasting small batches of coffee. This first one is called the Aurelio. It's a Danish company, and they call this the Bullet. And they've come out with the Bullet 1, the Bullet V2, the Bullet R2. As the neat thing, they, like with anybody, they improve roasters in time. Both from, again, just saying, hey, what do you think we are doing with this? Or a lot, I'm sure, are feedback from the customers that have bought that particular roaster, for example, and say, hey, gee, it would be nice if this happened, or you added this, or you added that. So most of them go through, thank goodness, a lot of, improvements, so that, and a lot of them would allow, it isn't where you say, well, I gotta, not have this or sell it, which you can, but some of the modifications can be added to the future roasters from that company. The next one we're going to talk about, this is called the BMR, and again, another good choice for, roasting coffee at home. Now, the one aside point on this, and this can roast up to 1 pound of capacity. If you say, I don't want to sell coffee, all I want to do is roast my own coffee, you can. There's nothing saying that you have to basically roast this and keep roasting with it. Oh, just roast when, I'm getting low on fresh coffee. And the biggest thing you have to be careful, and I will personify, is you've got to make sure that when you buy green coffee, for example, you keep it very well protected. And I had it in I would buy 65 pounds of green coffee beans from all over the world. Ethiopian was one of my favorite, but you wouldn't have it where I'm just going to store this bag of coffee, even though you close it up, in heat. No, you've got to keep it relatively stable. And where I was roasting coffee over in Davie, the room I was in, had air conditioning. The next one, and this is my first roaster, and I looked at all these that I'm showing you now to just start getting how does this work in learning how to roast coffee. This is called the Gene Cafe. Pretty darn cool unit. And what you're seeing is it's a form of a drum roaster. You put the beans in, where you lift up the cover and you put the beans in, and it would tell you how much to put in, because it was very important. It wouldn't be where you have to put a certain higher number in. You could do a smaller number, but don't go above the high recommendations, because then you're going to really have some issues with burning coffee. And the funny thing with this unit, the first time I roasted coffee on this, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And my wife runs out, because I was in this room. I did have a big garage door open when I was doing this. And she says, I smell something burning. Yeah, I went too far with too long a heat point, maybe not enough air. But the biggest thing with this, you're not, even though you don't want to destroy coffee, this isn't where it's a lot of coffee at any one time. So as you learn, you will say, wow, I messed that one up. But the next time you're a little smarter, a little wiser. And, this is how you can, it's like getting a bike with training wheels. You can't probably hurt yourself too much with this. And by the way, what's on the left, as you are roasting coffee, it gives off, in so many words, smoke. And, this has it where, and you would typically hook up a hose, not too long, but to get it where you're not just putting smoke right there at the coffee maker. The next one is called a hot top. Didn't use this, sort of nothing wrong with it, and it appears they still make it. It's, along the same line of where you would be rotating in air and heat and so on and so forth. And, sometimes people have these smaller roasters as what they call, just a sample roaster, where they might get some beans, let's say Ethiopian, and they say, well, let me do a test roast. And, that can help you where, and you're not using a lot of coffee, so you're not wasting coffee. Because as I mentioned, I would buy 65-pound bags of green bean from a company called Genuine Origin, and, pretty fair on the price per pound. And I think they had free shipping at the time. And, you have a lot of coffee to basically, get right along with it. Now, for specialty coffee shops and small commercial operations, the roasters offer larger capacities, more robust features suitable for a cafe or small-scale roasting business. Now, on the left, you're seeing an old Probat, one of the big names in the coffee roasting equipment businesses. And I'm telling you, this probably goes back 100 years, 50 years. I don't know exactly the date. Now, on the right is a company called Mill City. They make very good roasters, and they do a lot of training, et cetera, et cetera. And, they show you how to roast with it. I mean, there's a lot of things you can learn. And this is what's neat about the coffee roasting business, is if you want to say, I want to learn, in one sentence what to do, no, you're in the wrong business. But the neat thing about coffee roasting is there's so many variables. And again, these are drum roasters. And the only thing I would say, and those that have these older drum roasters, nothing wrong with them. They'll probably last longer than we will. But they basically roast the coffee with heat, of course, but it heats up a spinning internal drum. And the only thing you got to be very careful about, because the drum itself is metal, of course, inside here, and it's spinning, but the coffee keeps going around, and then it comes back down on the roaster drum. And if you're not careful, depending on how fast it's rotating and the amount of air, you could end up kind of hurting the beans, because you don't want them on that hot metal for very long at all. If in 2-3 seconds, that's fine. But if you're roasting too slow, you're gonna end up destroying the coffee. Anyway, the rise of electric and automated roasters is a significant trend. Now, what you're seeing here, and thank you to Dietrich, this is an example. You're seeing what's happening is coffee goes into the drum, and what's nice about the Dietrich is it's doing additional air in there and making sure the beans are rotating. Now, what it does is you've got to make sure that you're exhausting the heat and the smoke. And the biggest thing that happens when you start to roast coffee, there's on a coffee bean, there's what we call chaff. And that's when it's green and yada, yada, yada. But when it starts to roast, that chaff comes off. And you've got to have a way of ensuring that you're removing the chaff and getting it out of the roaster, because what will happen if it's still in there, it will, because that's not what is really generally part of the coffee roasting, or expecting that it would be fine if it sits there. No. Every one of these has a mechanism that sucks out that coating that's on the beans as it goes into its first level, and you're going to see that in a minute. The biggest thing, and this is just showing you a cooling tray without being cooled right now, but the point I'm trying to show is when you get the coffee to the point of where it's, whether you want it to be, a light roast, a medium, dark, when you, as we describe, pull the roast, meaning it's ready, it's done, and it's where I want it to be. You want it to, when it goes into a cooling tray, you want to make sure that, because that's hot coffee still. If you don't immediately start to cool the beans, they can roast a little bit more. So if you said I wanted a medium roast and you mess up and you don't cool the beans immediately, and I'm talking a good roasting cooler really pumps a lot of fresh air through these beans you've just brought out of the roaster, and it's going to cool them down very, very quickly. 30 seconds, 45 seconds, probably even not even a minute. But the point is, you don't want to roast it anymore, because now your roast isn't what you thought it was going to be. Now you see what's behind me. I don't know if you can see it real well, but that's, and you're going to see this a couple times, that's an actual blower. And that, in many forms, has it where it brings air into the roaster. It takes and has it where the air is pushing out that chaff that I just mentioned, and keeping the beans at a different, rotation. And you'll see one that I use or did use that would have where you really need a good blower like this. And this does two things. It brings coffee into the roaster, or air, and it helps move the roaster also, or the roasted coffee. It then also ensures that chaff gets blown out, in so many words, and you use that also, the blower, to cool the beans. So it's got 2 or 3 different purposes, and there are things you don't want to skimp on, and this is one of them. Now, what you're seeing now is a thermocoil couple. And what this does is they're all in different forms. All roasters should have a heat monitoring probe. Now, what I did with the roaster that you're going to see that I started roasting coffee for a business, I would have I had literally 4 connections. One would be the room temperature. because that makes a difference. If it's 80 degrees in a room or 70 degrees in a room, that in itself is going to affect the coffee in general as you're roasting. Not the biggest, how would you say, factor, but it's something you need to keep an eye on. You also want to see what the bean temperatures are. So this would be suspended in the middle of where the beans are, and it would be telling you pretty much accurately what the temperature of the beans are. And I also used to have a probe on my exhaust so that I like toys anyway, but it's so I could see the heat going out. And again, these are all things that have to work together. So these are very, very important. If they're off by anything, even 2, 3, 4 degrees, you might have it where you think you're roasting to a certain temperature. And each roaster you get used to that a certain temperature, you will be getting a certain roast in so many words when you get up to that temperature. So it's got to be very, very accurate. At the end of this, you'll see what I use to computerize my whole setup. This is just one of the controls. In this case, it would show the heat that the roaster is getting up to, because what I will explain again is, for example, you might say, I'm going to heat my roast to 400 degrees. And as you get used to the roaster, as long as everything's accurate, you'll know what type of roast, light, medium, dark, or burnt, you can tell from looking at this and see the temperature. Now, these are what we call the stages of roasting. And we want to just explain a gas drum roaster is a classic and widely used machine for transforming green coffee beans into aromatic, flavorful beans we use to brew coffee. It operates on the principle of heating a rotating drum for the beans inside through a combination of different heat transfer methods. The key components, a gas drum roaster is comprised of several, and you're seeing behind me, that is technically a drum roaster. And by the way, what you see in front of it, I'll move my head this way a little bit, that's the cooling tray. So the minute you open up the roaster and the beans come out, that tray is barraged with a high amount of cool air. And as I said earlier, it basically wants to make sure that you're not continuing to roast the beans after you've pulled the roast. So, very, very important. We have the bean hopper. That's where you put the beans in. A roasting drum, it's a cylindrical chamber that rotates horizontally. As it spins, it tumbles coffee beans, ensuring they all are exposed to the heat evenly. And that's where I said earlier about ensuring it's rotating properly and not having where the rotation is too slow, to the extent that when the beans get turned up and come back down, then they're getting picked right back up again, and not just sitting on that drum doing what we call conductive heating. And again, that will, kind of mess up your roast. Now, the other thing that's interesting is these roasters have, and they're all different, but they all do the same. There's a little port in the front of the roaster, and it's got a little funnel. And what it does is, periodically, yes, they all have windows so you can see what color the temperature of, or the color of the beans to know where you are in your roast. This has it where you put it in, pull out, and it brings a small sample of beans out. You can look at it real quickly and you say, okay, we know where we are. You put them back in, you don't waste any, and you go from there. Now, a lot of the drum roasters use, different flames, and when I get into the whole point of my own roasting, you'll see why I chose what I chose. Now, as I mentioned, the exhaust system, it removes smoke, it removes the chaff and dried skin that comes off the beans during roasting and other byproducts. Airflow is a key variable that roasters manipulate to control the roast. Now, again, you can see the cooling tray, and that's extremely important to make sure that when you decide the roast is ready, you basically cool it as fast as you possibly can. So the neat thing is, it's so exciting to be doing this. Anyway, all of these have what we call control modules. You control the air, the rotation, the amount of heat. Now, the symphony of heat, the magic of coffee roasting lies in precise application of heat over time. This is achieved through a combination of three types of heat transfer. Conduction. This is what I mentioned. It cannot be good if it's a drum roaster and you're not rotating the drum fast enough. You're going to have where it says, this occurs when the coffee beans come into direct contact with the hot metal surface of the drum. This is a very efficient way to transfer heat. So again, if you handle it correctly, where again the drum is turning fast enough, it comes down on the drum, but it does get some of the process of it, heating the bean, but not to any extent where it's throwing it way off. And this is where I say, but too much can lead to scorching or uneven roasting. So that is probably one of the toughest hurdles to get over when you're using a drum roaster, so on and so forth. Now, convection, that's another type of heat. This is the transfer of heat through the movement of hot air. The gas burners heat the air, which is then drawn through rotating drum by the exhaust fan. This hot air envelops the beans, roasting them more gently, evenly than conduction alone. So you're really doing a whole bunch of combination. And another part of the roasting is called radiation. The hot walls of the drum and even the other beans emit infrared radiation, which also contributes to the roasting process. A skilled roaster carefully manipulates the balance of these heat transfer methods throughout the roast to develop specific flavor profiles. Now, let's look at what you're looking at now are and I'm going to go over this, the stages of roast. Okay, it starts out with green beans. As they rotate, the chaff gets burnt off and moved out of the chamber, and it's harmlessly, in so many ways, thrown away. The first process that you would see is, and this is called the drying stage. The first few minutes, the primary goal is to evaporate the moisture within the green beans. The beans will turn green from green to a yellowish color. So again, you have a window that you can see the beans, but you also have that little tester so you can put it in, pull a small sample of beans out, look at it real quick, say, okay, I know where I am, put it back in so you're not like throwing those beans away, and it's done fast enough so they can still continue within the roast. Now, when you get to the Maillard reaction and browning stage, as the temperature increases, the Maillard reaction, a chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars, begins. This is where many of the desirable flavor and aroma compounds are created. The beans will start to turn brown. Now, the neatest thing, when you get coffee, it will tell you on typically the label on the beans, because the seller of the beans, and as I mentioned earlier, genuine origin, they test all the coffee they get in. They do what they call, a sample roast. They also do what they call cupping. I won't even really get into it, but what you're doing is you're slurping now in water the beans to whatever level you've roasted them and ground them. And that's where you end up getting some of the flavors that you will see that's on coffee saying it's like chocolate, orange, so on and so forth. And so when they're selling the coffee, they will rate the coffee to a certain level. And the better the rating, the more expensive it is. And they will also reemphasize again what they tasted in their cupping sessions. And I'll probably in a later video go over cupping. There's so many things to go over, it's great. And I know I make them a little bit too long, but now as the coffee is roasting, you will get into what we call first crack. Now, remember, the beans start out as green beans. There's moisture in them. But as you're progressing through the roast, when the coffee gets to a certain roast level, you will literally hear, it sounds like popcorn, actually. And that is what we call first crack. And some might pull the roast at that level with first crack, because that means that it's at a relatively light to medium roast. And it's important, again, and I even had, and you'll see at the last image, you'll see where I literally had to put a microphone so that I could hear. The blower was too loud, kind of. But, what would you do the next time you do, and as I'm progressing in that direction? But I had a microphone so that I could hear the roast. I could hear when, first crack had started. Now, you're also looking at temperature. So you kind of get an idea as you get used to a roaster about when and what temperature you're going to go into what we call first crack. This is a crack. This is a critical marker in the roasting process, indicating that the beans are becoming light roasted. So not only are you looking at color, you're also looking at, what you're hearing. So that's why it's so important to make sure you're, doing the roast you want. After the first crack, the roaster carefully controls the heat and airflow to develop the desired flavors longer, and the longer the roast continues after first crack, the darker the roast will become. And there's so many different levels, but really the three again: light roast, medium roast, and dark roast. And I'm going to talk about right now what we call second crack. So if you wanted to just do a relatively light roast to a medium roast, you pull it right after first crack. But if you say, no, I want to go longer, because I would have people say, I want dark roast. Now that's kind of difficult, because when you get to be into a real dark roast, it can go easily from a viable dark roast to burnt coffee. So when you get into second crack, if the roast continues, the beans will undergo a second, more violent crack as the internal structure of the bean begins to fracture. This indicates a very dark roast, and care must be taken not to over roast the beans into a burnt and oily stage. And when I told you when I used that Gene Cafe, my first roast, my wife came out and said, "What are you going to burn the house down? Burn the house down?" Anyway, now cooling. Again, the cooling tray that I talked about earlier, so that's nothing new. But the point is, whatever roast you want, make sure that you are actually pulling the roast and cooling it ASAP. So, talking again about a light roast, could be rich, chocolatey notes of a dark roast. There's all different taste profiles from a light roast all the way to a very dark roast. And, I never would, I had one customer that would say, I want my coffee dark. And I would worry because, again, there's that fine line between a dark roast, a real dark roast, and burnt coffee or burnt coffee. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about what we call fluidation. This is a process where a bed of solid particles, in this case green coffee beans, is made to behave like a fluid. That's why they call it a fluid bed. And this is the type of roaster that I had, and there you can see it. The lower portion, you can see the cooling tray. Now, you can't really see it, but down in the way lower right, there is where, when I would pull the beans, I would make sure to open up a door and air would go through a device down on the lower side there on the right, and that would be bringing tons of air through that cooling tray. And you can you can see, and I'll explain more as we get into it, what we're doing here and why it's called a fluid bed. Again, you see the thing. Now, I had the pleasure of, and the roaster on the left is the Artesian 3E, and that is what we call a fluid bed roaster. And what you would do is you would open up the top, put the beans down inside, and the control panel, you'll see another picture of it too, but the control panel, one would be for heat, the right would be on heat, and you'd put it on, and on the left would be the amount of air that is coming up, and what it does is it pushes the beans up, so they're not touching anything. You're not touching the side of the roasting the roasting device, and you can see it so well because you got a light on it. And again, you'll see again later where I had to make sure I was able to hear first crack and second crack. Now, what's neat about what's happening in the coffee business, all these companies make big improvements. My 3E was good. I could roast about, I think, 15, 16 pounds an hour. Each roast would last 10 minutes, give or take. Now, coffee crafters, and I like them and I appreciate, I'm using their images, but what the 3E turned into in the time that I wasn't doing coffee into the Valenta 3, and again, relatively same principle it is, fluid bed, but you've got your heating dial, heat on and off, and your air. Now what they've done, which is neat, is they have much quieter, what you saw, the blowers basically, so that you're making sure that you can, and it's called lofting. But what you're seeing on the right picture and what's lighted is, again, a chamber where air and heat, hot air, is going in. But the point is, you have to keep them moving. So if all of a sudden you lost power, I'm using a stupid example, but if you lost power and the beans just stopped, you probably would damage the roast big time. So you got to monitor it, keep an eye on it, and make sure that you're not messing it up. Okay, what you're seeing again, this is the same of my roaster, but that's the control panel, and you can see it's a little closer picture where you have the dial for the heat, the dial for the air, but in the middle, you're seeing a number where it's telling me how hot, not where the beans are, but the roaster itself, how hot is that temperature getting up to? So you would be saying, and you're going to see in a minute, but you'd be saying, okay, the roaster itself is literally maybe getting up to 700 degrees, 580, 650. Obviously, if that amount of heat was getting into the beans, you destroy them. And that's why you end up having what I did here. And it doesn't mean you have to always do this, but I would monitor my roasts. And I get used to, and you can see one of the temperature devices that has two connections. And again, as I said earlier, I'm sorry for the thunder. I hope we don't lose power. But anyway, I'm almost done. But, I could monitor watching the slope of the curve and watching the temperature of both the beans, the roaster, and even my exhaust temperature. So and you don't necessarily have to do this. Most roasters say, I don't need computer monetization or control. I just liked doing it. You enjoyed the process of seeing each roast, and you can say, I really enjoyed the last roast I did, and you can make a copy, computer-wise, of that roast. So when you say, I'm going to roast just like that, you can literally put that roast on the screen and start a new roast and make sure you're following the same aspects of that first roast to the second roast that you said, hey, I really like the way it is. Now, I am finishing up here. This, you're seeing a live picture of my unit with the loft of beans. And again, depending on how hot you want them to get, you, in essence, set the amount of the temperature and the amount of air, and you're monitoring your temperature, and you see the microphone. That's so that I could hear, and I mentioned this earlier, I could hear first crack. And if, again, that person that said, hey, I want my coffee like dark, 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 I'd go to second crack, and I'd hear that too. And, you would have to look at the temperature, and if you see what's going into that area and hopefully I'll go back there and you'll see, well, maybe you won't, but yeah, you will. There, see the probe that's sticking down, coming down? That is not, in essence, the roaster temperature. It's the bean temperature. So I would know from that where I was and where I was going. And again, the microphone so that I could hear first crack. I know these are long, and I really appreciate you helping me, being here. And, I love helping people. And part of what I look at YouTube is helping people get better at whatever they want to do. So I want to thank you very, very much for being here. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Please ask questions. I always feel if you don't ask questions, no one's interested. But anyway, in today's world of the political world, you want to have additional sources of revenue. And coffee roasting, where you would roast your own coffee for yourself too, but you'd also, as I did, as you can see down in the lower right corner, that was my packaging process. And you can take this to, fairs, where people are selling knickknacks and what have you. Coffee is a great product to take to one of these markets and have it where you sell your coffee and you make a little money. Because you buy, last thing I'll say, when you're doing your own coffee, you buy the coffee beans cheaper than you would buy anywhere else. And you're doing the labor of the roasting. And yes, you've got to have a package concept and so on and so forth. I had a spreadsheet that I used, and I certainly would share this with anybody. The spreadsheet, because you got to be careful. You don't want to say, well, my beans cost me $6.50 a pound. You got to make sure you're putting in, and it won't even where you're putting in your own time, actually, because then you'd probably price your coffee out of what makes sense. But you want to make sure you're putting into the total calculated cost, the cost of the bags, labels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that you have to really make sure, unless you want to lose your shirt, of just making sure you put all your true costs in so that you come up with, and that typically would be each one of those is a pound of coffee. So I would know that particular pound of coffee might be $12.81 would be my cost totally. And you might say, well, I'm going to sell it for $16. I'm just using numbers. And it isn't where you'd say, oh, wow, I'm going to be rich. No, but if you make $4 or $5 every time you sell a pound of coffee, hey, it mounts up and you feel good and you're having fun doing it also. So there isn't much of a downside. But anyway, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. Take care.